Now, we have 17 minutes for questions and answers. I know Secretary Schiffer has to leave at about noon. Can you stay for a couple of minutes?
I can certainly stay for a couple of minutes.
All right. Why don't we see if there are any questions for him? Yes.
Thank you. Tacy Schiffer from CSIS. Michael Schiffer started his remarks by talking about the rise of India and China. The rest of the discussion basically spoke as if there were two powers, a rising one, China, and a currently dominant one whose dominance was arguably at issue, the United States. If you think about it in terms of two rising powers at different stages of rise, and three powers with some level of dominance, and I would say the United States, Russia, Japan all fall into that category in different ways. What does that do to your construct of kind of the geometry of power in the region and to the strategic challenge we face?
I will give you a wholly unsatisfactory and bureaucratic answer to part of the question, which is that I limited my comments to the countries that are actually within my area of responsibility, so as to avoid the scorn and opprobrium of my colleagues. I think the larger point, though, I mean, is one that is entirely on point and accurate, and this is one of the reasons why I think the administration is putting a renewed emphasis on seeking to engage in the region in real, functional, problem-solving multilateral architecture, because we are dealing with an incredibly complicated situation. I would argue, and as some of the other comments here spoke to, the likes of which the world hasn't seen for 150, possibly 400 years in terms of the number of countries that are going up, others going down or sideways, just the changing patterns in diffusion and distribution of power around the globe. So the fact that my comments this morning happen to focus on China in large part, but also Japan and Korea as opposed to our three Southeast Asian treaty allies, you should see more as a function of what's in my lane. But the point that this is a much more complicated calculation in which we need to be able to track the interplay and interaction between all of the different players in the game is one that's well taken, and hopefully something that we'll be able to do as we coordinate across offices and across the administration. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Betty Lin of the World Journal. Recently, Admiral Mahnken talked about he has shifted from curious about the intent of Chinese military build-up to generally concerned. And could you address what triggered or what caused the shift? And also, there's a recent press report citing Chinese delegates to the Shangri-La dialogue, saying that they say the meal-to-meal with U.S. won't resume until after the potential sale of F-16s to Taiwan is concluded. So could you comment on that also? Thank you.
I don't think that our view of and our questions that we have about Chinese growing military capabilities have changed. I mean, this is an issue that we have and will continue to track, in which we continue to seek to reach out and engage with China and with the PLA on, so that we can have a fuller and deeper and richer dialogue and understanding. In terms of the military-to-military relationship, as I think I said, we stand prepared to work with China when China is prepared to work with us, so that we can fulfill the agreement of our two presidents to build a positive, cooperative, and comprehensive relationship.
All right, let's have questions for any of the participants now. Yes, sir.
Actually, this is for the Deputy Assistant Secretary, but I'd be happy to hear comments from the other panelists as well. My name is Michael Choi. I'm a former NSCP fellow. Is there any thought of recreating formal trilateral cooperation between U.S., Japan, and Korea? There has been a lot of talk from you, Deputy Assistant Secretary Schiffer, as well as Deputy Secretary Steinberg, on traditional alliances. And it seems like Japan and Korea is the traditional allies of the region with a lot of common interest, especially in comparison to China.
Sure. I guess the question really would be what you would consider to be formal cooperation or dialogue. As you may know, at the Shangri-La Dialogue, just recently we had the second annual meeting of our three defense ministers, and they all agreed that we need to seek ways to deepen trilateral cooperation and consultations. We just finished up at the working level today in Tokyo a meeting of the defense trilateral talks, and have plans for a plenary level, so a more senior level discussion of the defense trilateral talks this September. So I'd offer that there is a lot that's going on, driven by the interests and the desires of all three countries to see us deepen coordination and cooperation between the United States, Japan, and Korea. And I apologize for having to leave. This is driven entirely by my not wanting to lose my car to take me back across the river, and nothing to do with my desire to get out of this very interesting and worthwhile discussion. But my thanks, and I will look forward to having the opportunity to engage with you all again at some point in the near future.
Could I just...
Yes.
As you go out the door, could I just ask one quick question? Mark Valencia, you talked about China's assertiveness in the South China and East China Seas. I'm wondering, is it only China's assertiveness, or are we doing something qualitatively different? For example, have we been tickling their defenses in a way that we didn't do before? Are we tracking their nuclear submarines in a way that we haven't done before? And why have the incidents stopped? Has there been some agreement to disagree?
I'd hope that you would not answer the question about tracking submarines and tickling their defenses, but I'd be interested to hear if you would.
Followed very shortly by my letter of resignation. I would offer that we have not changed our behavior. China has changed its behavior. I think it's as simple as that.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. I think he's gone. He's left the room. Okay. All right.
Hi, I'm Jeanine Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Would you address the possibility that Myanmar is now pursuing nuclear weapons, and how would that affect our relationship, the U.S. relationship with Myanmar and with Southeast Asia and South Asia as well?
Would you like?
One of the great pleasures of being in academia is I can say whatever I want, and it really doesn't matter. If you don't believe me, just ask my wife. No, look, I think whatever the facts are with the Burmese nuclear program, and certainly I turn to people like David Albright, who I think has a very good track record on this for my information. The proliferation of nuclear weapons in Asia is a trend that we need to pay great attention to. And we need to be paying attention to the links, to other countries that have nuclear weapons and nuclear technology, and work very hard to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And I think we also need to think about not desire, but we also need to think about what will be the impact as these weapons spread, because I think the historian in me says that countries renounce nuclear weapons generally because of large-scale political change. because the regime in power loses power and so forth. But once a country's gotten nuclear weapons, they tend not to give them up, absent large-scale political change. And so I think that points us on a path to thinking about how we can solve some of these challenges, or the conditions under which these challenges would be solved.
I'm going to take the liberty of trying to address the earlier question on the Taiwan Strait, just to call attention to what I think is a very strategically significant development, and that is, I think before long we're going to see an economic cooperation framework agreement signed. I think that's going to be good for Taiwan and China as well, and the economy of that region. But I think it points to a process in which we have to look over the long term to see increasing economic integration across the straits, cooperation, integration. And then we're going to see, I think, in the future, maybe the second term, if there is indeed one, of the current administration in Taiwan. But we'll see confidence-building measures, I hope. I would certainly encourage the Chinese in that direction. And both presidents have talked about a peace agreement, albeit in a distant, somewhat distant, at least second term in terms of Taiwan, if that comes about. I think that's an enormously positive prospect. Not a, I don't even know if I want to call it likelihood, but certainly prospect. It's something the U.S. should encourage, and I think it then gets us out of the dilemma of this continual arms sales circumstance, potentially. If tensions in the area resolve, then the U.S. will respond accordingly, I'm sure. So I think the U.S. isn't going to change its policy, and I would encourage on arms sales and so on the Chinese to get back on military-to-military discussions without the precondition that you were suggesting. I think is a total non-starter. And to get back on the track or accelerate the track that both sides are on in terms of increasing cooperation across the straits. So I hope the Chinese will get off their current holding military-to-military ties hostage to the unobtainable in U.S. policy and stick with this long-term, strategically much more productive approach.
Okay, we have time for a few more. If you could please just keep them brief. Yes.
Hi, I'm Michael Beckley from Columbia University, and I have a question for Professor Mahnken. Could you expand a little bit on your comment that Western observers may be underestimating China's military power? Because we all know about their acquisition of potentially asymmetric capabilities and their rising defense spending. But these need to be tempered with acknowledgement of the weaknesses of the civilian technological infrastructure and the fact that China's cut off from Western defense networks and so probably doesn't have access to a lot of cutting-edge capabilities. So is there anything in your research that suggests that China's rising acquisitions of technologies are also being coupled with an ability to use them effectively in battle? Or is this just a case of something that looks more impressive on paper but may not actually be actual capabilities? Thank you.
Well, the short. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for the question. The short answer is we really don't know. And what I was referring to is there. If you look back historically, and maybe I think one of the better analogies to be drawn is looking at outside observers of Japan's military modernization between World War I and World War II. There's a consistent track record of underestimating just how quickly and how expansively Japan was able to modernize its military. And not due to ethnocentrism, in part due to Japanese secrecy, but a lot due to just the very real human propensity to look backwards in projecting forwards. And so Japan had, frankly, a sort of a mediocre, certainly Air Corps, mediocre army in the early 20th century, and folks projected that into the future. And I think in at least some of the scholarship that I read about the Chinese military, I see similar signs. In other words, looking backwards to try to judge the future. And I think that's a concern. I think the flip side of that concern is that the Chinese may very well overestimate their own capabilities. I mean, you have a leadership, a military leadership, and a military that, well, parts of it haven't seen combat since the late 1970s. Part haven't really seen large-scale combat since the Korean War. You've had leadership, generational change. You have acquisition, as you point out, of new generations of technology, doctrine that's evolving. So I see uncertainty on both sides. But specifically referring to Admiral Willard's statement, I mean, what Admiral Willard is saying, and he's a better one to judge the state of the intelligence on China than I am. It was his judgment that U.S. intelligence had systematically underestimated Chinese military modernization.
Tom is too modest to say so, but he's written an excellent book on precisely this topic called Uncovering Ways of War, U.S. Intelligence and Foreign Military Innovation, 1918 to 1945. So
available in paperback.
That's a plug. I expect a penny in royalties. Okay, we have time for one more very quick question. Yes.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, thank you, Aaron. Jonathan Pollock. I'll ask a question to my colleague at the Naval War College, but I have to come here to Washington in order to ask him.
Sure.
It seems to me in different ways what we've seen represented on this panel are I don't want to call it schizophrenia that exists or the parallelism that exists simultaneously. Deputy Assistant Secretary Schiffer is no longer here, but he was really talking about sort of the day-to-day stuff that governments and militaries do with one another as you try to evolve some kind of a framework within which states go about their business. Mike Lampton has emphasized very, very much, if you will, the countervailing influence of economic power and economic interdependence as a factor that is changing the kind of context and framework within which we conceptualize geopolitics. Tom is raising, it seems to me, the question of the likelihood of or the possibilities of military conflict, in particular high-end military conflict. When you talked, Tom, before about the whole idea you've got cooperation, you've got competition in between, and then you've got conflict. So the question really to ask is how any of those who are still up there on the panel would rate the possibilities of overt military conflict. Asia-Pacific region, despite everything that we know, has gone through a remarkable, I don't call it benign period, but we haven't had wars. Would anyone want to characterize what contributes to whether that pattern persists over time? Thank you.
Well, I'll just take a stab at the latter part of your question. I would rate the likelihood or the probability to be very low of high-end conflict. And I think it would represent an enormous failure, a collective failure of leadership in both countries if we ever got anything anywhere near that. Having said that, I think the probability of incidents is in some cases rather high. I mean, we've already had the Hainan incident just as sort of indicative of what I mean. But with these incidents in the South and East China Sea, naval incidents on not only Japan, but earlier in this administration, even with our own ships and Chinese vessels, we've seen the possibility, and it wouldn't have been too big a stretch to get somebody killed in one of those incidents, and then we're off into something more politically significant. So I think the probability of incidents is moderate to maybe even high, depending on what we're defining. But I take the high-end conflict to be very low, and we really have to make decisions that were absolutely contrary to other vital interests to get to that point.
Tom, a sentence or two.
Yeah, not even a paragraph. I'll generally, I would say generally low, in part because I think there's a realization on all parts that the consequences of such a large-scale conflict would be tremendous. So I think low, but should we be heading towards conflict? I think that would be extremely worrisome too, because that would presume that the leadership in Beijing, for example, would already have made the calculation that it's worth risking conflict. But again, the historian in me says chances of crises, incidents, greater than in the past.
Okay, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the members of the panel. And Rich, I turn the helm back over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I find myself wanting Aaron now to clear the air, tell us what the bottom line is, and so on. I guess, the way I read this is that we have an extremely dynamic and ambiguous balance of power in the world as a consequence of the tremendous change, difficulty for one side to estimate what the other side really can do and intends to do. With all that ambiguity, you do raise concerns and levels of competition and insecurity. I think that's clear. And in those periods of time, you, as a decision maker, seek, number one, to increase your own power and capacity to act independently if you have to. Second, you reach out to as many friends and potential friends as you can. There's hedging all over the region. We're doing it too. We're reaching out. India's reaching out, which is a healthy thing in an ambiguous situation. It's healthy that every nation's a little concerned, and so they're making friends where they haven't before. They're reaching over, such as between Korea and Japan, over difficult issues in history and so on, to seek accommodation and strategic coordination. And all these kinds of things, I think, are healthy. But that's how I'd characterize it if I were, but of course I'm not allowed to, so I'm going to continue here. And it's not my role, but there you go. Listen, thank you, Aaron, Michael, Mike, and Tom. Spectacular. Great questions.